It began with a single brass fitting, a forgotten valve nestled in the damp masonry of a sub-basement beneath London's St. Pancras. I touched the metal, and it felt unnervingly cold, colder than the surrounding stone, as if it were still drawing heat from a source that had been extinguished a century ago. Look at the blueprints provided by the official archives, then look at the stone. The math does not hold. The official narrative tells us these cathedrals of transit were built by men with pickaxes and steam shovels, labourers moving at the speed of a horse's gallop, yet we see precision that defies the era. Ask yourself how a society supposedly struggling with basic sanitation and horse-drawn logistics managed to erect vaulted ceilings of such immense load distribution that they remain unshaken by the thundering weight of modern locomotives. It is not a matter of style. It is not a matter of Victorian ambition. It is a matter of impossible physics. We are told these structures were built in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. We are told the workers carved these intricate friezes while living in squalor. Not this. Not that. Something else was happening here. I stood in the silence of that basement and realized that the brickwork didn't just support the station, it seemed to predate it. The station was a skin stretched over an older, more complex skeleton. What if the timeline we've been handed is a curated fiction, a decorative layer of paint over a much older, much stranger reality? Consider the sheer volume of red brick used in the mid-19th century. Billions of units, thousands of kilns that left no trace, a supply chain that would strain even our modern digital logistics. Yet, we are expected to believe it was all done with soot and muscle. I walked through the cavernous halls of Antwerp Central, watching the light hit the stone, and I felt the weight of institutional erasure. Why are the windows so large? Why is the ironwork tuned like a resonant instrument? If you look closely at the foundations of these grand terminals, you see the marks of a different intent. They call it the Gothic Revival. They call it neoclassical. These are labels designed to stop you from asking questions. They are linguistic cages. I found a map from 1842 that showed a rail network already in place, sprawling across a landscape that was supposedly still wilderness. The infrastructure exists before the industry that required it. It is as if the stations were found, not built. It is as if we inherited a world we did not create, and our only task was to scrape away the mud and call it progress. The anomaly grows when you move from the city centres to the desolate fringes. In the middle of nowhere, where the population could not justify a shed, you find palaces of glass and steel. Why build a cathedral for a village of 500? Why install load distribution systems capable of supporting 10 times the weight of a Victorian locomotive? The engineers speak of future-proofing, but this isn't foresight, it's an echo. I tracked the architectural DNA from London to New York, from Paris to the furthest reaches of the Russian steppe. The patterns are identical, the same heights, the same conductive copper roofs, the same subterranean chambers that lead nowhere. You see it in the way the stone is cut, not with a chisel, but with a frequency. There is a specific vibration to these spaces, an acoustic signature that suggests they weren't meant for waiting for trains, but for something involving the movement of energy. The official records are strangely silent on the source of the stone. The quarries are empty, yet the stations remain. Ask yourself, who truly moved these mountains? What if the trains were an afterthought? What if we are using ancient power plants as mere transit hubs because we forgot how to turn the lights on? The gatekeepers of history will tell you that the 19th century was a golden age of engineering, but they cannot explain the sheer speed of the construction. They point to black and white photographs of men in top hats standing in front of half-finished walls, but look closer at those photos. Look at the shadows. Look at the lack of scaffolding. In many of these images, the construction looks more like an excavation. They are digging the buildings out of the earth. The mud flood theory isn't just a fringe curiosity. It is a visible scar on the landscape of every major rail hub. Why are the first floor windows of these stations buried halfway underground? Why do the grand entrances sit 20 feet above the original street level? Not a design choice, not an aesthetic whim, a recovery effort. We are looking at a global civilization that was buried, and the rail networks were the veins that were pulled back to the surface first. The institutional gatekeeping is relentless because the truth would invalidate every textbook on our shelves. It would suggest that we are not the peak of human achievement, but the scavengers of a fallen giant. I spent weeks in the archives of the Pennsylvania Railroad hunting for a single receipt for the stone used in the old Penn station. I found nothing but ledger gaps. The money moved, but the materials appeared from thin air. This is the hallmark of the erasure trope, the disappearance of the process while the product remains. They want us to focus on the beauty of the arches, so we don't notice the impossibility of their origin. It is a sleight of hand performed on a tectonic scale. In every city, the story is the same. A fire destroys the old wooden records. A flood washes away the maps. A new department is formed to standardize history. What remains is a sanitized version of events where a few brilliant men built a world in a weekend. But the stone remembers. The iron remembers. When you stand in the center of Grand Central, you aren't just in a station. You are inside a resonant chamber designed to interface with the atmosphere. The celestial ceiling isn't just art, it's a schematic, and yet we use it to buy tickets to Poughkeepsie. The tragedy isn't that we've lost the knowledge, it's that we're standing right in the middle of it and calling it a commute. Think about the sheer scale of the waste. To build these stations, they levelled hills and filled valleys, yet there are no records of where the dirt went. Millions of tons of earth vanished. Or perhaps it didn't vanish. Perhaps it was what covered the stations in the first place. I followed a lead to a small station in the Ural Mountains, a place where the train stops only once a day. The architecture there is identical to the Gare du Nord in Paris. How? In a pre-internet, pre-standardization world, how did two architects thousands of miles apart use the exact same measurements for their load-bearing columns? It wasn't a shared style, it was a shared blueprint, a global infrastructure network that functioned as a single organism. The institutional erasure has tried to chop this organism into pieces to tell us these were local triumphs of local men, but the symmetry is too perfect. The staccato rhythm of the pillars, the mathematical precision of the arches, it's a language, and we have forgotten how to read. We are like ants crawling over a discarded clock, marvelling at the shiny gears but oblivious to the concept of time. There is a sombre reality to the way these stations are being treated today. Many are being demolished, replaced by glass boxes that will not last 50 years. Why? Because the old buildings are evidence. They are massive, stone and iron witnesses to a history we aren't supposed to remember. Every time a renovation occurs, the original machinery in the basement is removed and sold for scrap. I saw a turbine being pulled from a station in Chicago that didn't match any known patent from the 1890s. It was made of an alloy that shouldn't have existed. It was whisked away before I could take a photo. Not for safety, not for progress, for concealment. Ask yourself why the most beautiful buildings in our cities are always the ones that are the hardest to maintain. Or so they tell us. What if they aren't hard to maintain? What if they are simply too dangerous to keep around because they provoke the wrong kind of thought? Every arch is a question. Every vaulted ceiling is a challenge to the status quo. They want us in the glass boxes because glass boxes don't have secrets. The pattern is undeniable. From the Union stations of the American West to the terminal hubs of India, the footprints are the same. These weren't just transit points, they were nodes. If you map the locations of these impossible stations, they align with ley lines and geomagnetic anomalies. They were tapping into something. The trains were simply the most convenient way for the New World Order to utilize the existing tracks. They put a steam engine on a line that was meant for something far more elegant. It's like finding a supercomputer and using it as a footstool. The staccato beat of the wheels on the tracks is the sound of a downgraded technology. We are told the 1800s were a time of invention, but everywhere I look, I see a time of adaptation. We adapted the old world to fit our limited understanding. We took the palaces and called them post offices. We took the power plants and called them stations. We took the light of the previous world and dimmed it so we wouldn't feel so small in its shadow. I found a photograph from 1860, a panoramic view of a city after a great fire. The station stands perfectly intact while everything around it is levelled. The stone is scorched, but the structure is unmoved. And there, in the corner of the frame, is a man standing by a hole in the ground. He isn't building. He's looking down into a tunnel that already has iron rails. This was before the city even had a transit authority. This is the smoking gun of the Tartarian infrastructure problem. The rails were already there. The stations were already there. The pioneers simply arrived and claimed them. It is the ultimate heist. We didn't build the modern world. We moved into a vacant one and changed the locks. The skepticism of authority isn't just a mindset. It's a necessity when the very ground you stand on is a lie. What if the Industrial Revolution was actually a massive clean-up operation? What if the smoke and soot were just a way to hide the fact that the old world ran on something much cleaner and much more powerful? Now we sit in the waiting rooms staring at the clocks, never wondering why the clocks are always so large, so ornate, and so perfectly synchronized. We are told it was for the schedules. We are told it was for the passengers. But the clocks are part of the mechanism too. They are the heartbeat of a system that is still idling, waiting for someone to remember the sequence. I look at the people around me, their heads down, their eyes on their screens, and I wonder if they can feel the resonance of the stone beneath their feet. The mystery doesn't end with a discovery, it ends with an open loop that refuses to close. We are living in the ruins of a masterpiece, and we have the audacity to call it a masterpiece of our own making. Ask yourself what happens when the scavenged parts finally wear out. What happens when the last of the impossible stations is torn down? We will be left with the glass boxes and a silence we won't know how to fill. The evidence is all around us, hidden in plain sight, carved into the granite and cast in the iron. It is not a secret. It is just a truth that no one is allowed to say. What if the end of the line isn't a destination, but a realization? I descended further into the service tunnels beneath the Gare du Nord, where the air grows thin and tastes of ancient scorched mineral. Here, the staccato rhythm of the modern city above fades into a heavy, oppressive silence. This is the realm of the load. Distribution anomalies. The pillars here do not taper. They expand into the bedrock with a fluid geometry that suggests they were poured, not laid, not stone, not concrete, something else. A geopolymer. that defies the carbon dating of the official narrative. Ask yourself why the foundations of a mid-19th century transit hub exhibit the same molecular density as high-performance aerospace ceramics. The institutional gatekeepers point to the industrial catalogues of the 1860s, but those catalogues are ghosts. They list products that no factory of the time could produce. They describe processes that require a stable, high-voltage electrical environment which supposedly didn't exist for another 40 years. We are told these stations were the triumph of the coal age, yet the very marrow of their structure speaks of a silent, luminous power. What if the coal was just a mask? A way to explain away the heat and light of a system we were no longer allowed to understand. I found a series of photographs in a private collection in Lyon, dated 1855. They show the construction of the local terminal, but the images are wrong. There are no horses. There are no piles of excavated dirt. There is only a massive metallic dome, glowing with a soft internal luminescence, surrounded by men who look less like builders and more like looters. They are stripping away the conductive elements. They are covering the iridescent surfaces with layers of mundane grey stone. This is the erasure trope in its most visceral form, the systematic camouflaging of its superior reality. The narrator of our history has been careful to frame the 1800s as a time of grit and smoke, but the architecture tells a story of elegance and frequency. Look at the windows again. Not for light, not for ventilation, for the transmission of waves. The glass in these impossible stations was originally a leaded crystal, tuned to specific resonances. When you replace that crystal with modern plate glass, you kill the building. You silence the instrument. And that is exactly the point. A silent building is a building that cannot testify. The global pattern is the most terrifying aspect. In the middle of the Australian outback, at a junction that leads to no significant settlement, there stands a station with the same vaulted complexity as the heart of London. How? Why? The official record speaks of projected growth and imperial ambition, but these are empty phrases. You do not build a cathedral of transit for a population that does not exist unless the station serves a purpose beyond transit. It was a node in the planetary grid. The rails were the arteries and the stations were the pumps. When you look at the map of the 19th century rail expansion, it doesn't follow the path of trade. It follows the path of recovery. They were reclaiming a network that had been buried in the great mud flood, a cataclysm that has been scrubbed from the collective memory but remains visible in the sunken first floors of every capital city on earth. We are told the lower levels are for storage. Ask yourself, why would an architect put their most ornate stonework and grandest windows in a basement? Not a choice, a consequence. The skepticism I feel is shared by the shadows in these halls. I met a man in the tunnels beneath Cincinnati who had spent 30 years mapping the void spaces behind the station walls. He showed me chambers that were never meant for human entry. They were filled with massive copper coils, now corroded and dead, but still pulse with a residual charge during a lightning storm. The institutional erasure of these components is near total. They are labelled as experimental boilers or obsolete plumbing. In the rare instances they are acknowledged at all, but a boiler does not require a geometric alignment with the North Star. A plumbing system does not require gold-plated terminals. We are standing inside a global machine and we are being told it's just a place to civilization that understood the secret of the sound. Not this history, not that legend, something else. A global culture that was dismantled and rebranded while the smoke was still rising from the ruins. In the archives of a defunct rail line in the Balkans, I found a ledger that didn't track passengers. It tracked vibration levels. The station master was required to log the pitch of the building every hour. If the pitch drifted, he had to adjust the tension in the iron rafters. This isn't railroading. This is acoustics. This is the management of a resonant cavity. The impossible train stations were being used to stabilize the local environment, to draw power from the ionosphere and distribute it to the surrounding area. This is why the cities grew around them. They were the fountains of life for the old world. Now they are just empty shells, their tongues cut out by the new masters. We feel the tension when we enter these spaces because the building is trying to speak to us through the soles of our feet, but we have forgotten how to listen. We are deaf to the symphony of the stone. The contrast of scale becomes a philosophical burden. Why were we made so small, or why were these buildings made so large? The Victorian explanation is one of grandeur and inspiring the masses, but that is the logic of a museum, not a utility. You do not build a 100-foot ceiling to keep the rain off a commuter. You build it to accommodate a specific wavelength of energy. The atmospheric harvesters that once sat atop these stations were tuned to the height of the ceiling. It was a closed-loop system. The institutional gatekeepers have removed the harvesters and replaced them with decorative finials, but the internal geometry remains. It is a haunting experience to stand in the centre of an empty terminal at 3 a.m. and realise that the space was designed for something far more magnificent than a crowd of people. It was designed for the light. I followed the trail of the erased architects, the men whose names are on the plaques but whose personal histories are blank. They have no birth records. They have no graves. They appear in a city. Design a masterpiece that would take a modern firm 10 years to plan, and then they vanish. They weren't architects. They were recovery agents. Their job was to provide a plausible modern origin for the structures being unearthed. They were the authors of the fiction. They gave the impossible a name and a date, and we, in our desperate need for order, accepted it. Ask yourself, if you found a city buried in your backyard, would you tell the world, or would you put your name on it and charge rent? The Tartarian infrastructure problem is a problem of ownership. We are squatting in the ruins of a giant's palace and calling ourselves the kings of the hill. The sombre reality is that the clock is running out on the evidence. The modernization programs are stripping away the last of the original components. They are replacing the resonant brick with hollow drywall. They are covering the geopolymer foundations with asphalt. They are killing the witnesses. I stood in the shadow of a demolition crane in Philadelphia, watching a 140-year-old arch crumble, and I saw something in the debris, a piece of the inner core. It wasn't stone. It was a complex, honeycombed lattice of glass and metal. It was a circuit. It was beautiful. And a minute later, it was crushed into gravel for a parking lot. Not this preservation, not that heritage, something else, a deliberate destruction of the truth. The gatekeepers are in a hurry now. They know that we are starting to ask the right questions. They know that the staccato rhythm of our curiosity is reaching a crescendo. What if the unresolved philosophical open loop is the only thing that can save us? The realization that we have been lied to is the first step toward remembering who we actually are. The impossible stations are not just buildings, they are mirrors. They reflect a version of humanity that was connected, powerful, and free. They show us what we lost, and they challenge us to take it back. I looked at the face of the massive clock in the terminal, the gold hands moving with a precision that should be impossible for their age. They are still ticking. The system is still there, beneath the mud and the lies. The power is waiting. The train is at the platform, but it isn't the train we think it is. It is a journey back to a truth that was never supposed to be found. The question isn't where the tracks go. The question is, who are you when you finally step off the train? I found myself standing in the subterranean vaults of the Leipzig Central Station, where the air is still and heavy with the weight of 400,000 tons of sandstone. Here, the load distribution is not merely a matter of engineering, it is a declaration of power. The pillars are so massive that they defy the logistical capabilities of the 1910s, yet there they stand, anchored into a bedrock that seems to have been melted to receive them. Ask yourself how the German Empire, embroiled in the mounting tensions of a world war, found the excess energy to move blocks of stone that would make a pharaoh tremble. The official narrative says it was the height of European rail, a final flourish of the old guard, but if you trace the foundations, you find they extend far beyond the station's footprint, connecting to a network of tunnels that were sealed before the first brick was ever laid. Not this expansion, not that modernisation, something else, a reclamation of a pre-existing fortification. The station was not built to welcome the traveller. It was built to house the hardware of a world that was being systematically dismantled. The pattern of institutional erasure is written into the very stone of these terminals. Look at the way the newer masonry meets the old. There is a seam, a jagged line, where the craftsmanship of the Victorian era pales in comparison to the monolithic blocks beneath. It is as if a child attempted to repair a watch with a hammer. We are told the 19th century was a leap forward, but every piece of physical evidence suggests it was a frantic attempt to mimic a technology that was already decaying. In the ruins of the Anhalt station in Berlin, I found a fragment of an insulator that had been mislabeled as a decorative urn. It was made of a high-purity porcelain that remains non-conductive even at voltages that would melt modern copper. This is the erasure trope in its most subtle form, the renaming of the functional as the ornamental. If the people believe it is art, they will not ask why it is connected to a lead-sheathed cable that runs 300 feet into the earth. They will simply admire the glaze. What if the great rail strikes of the late 1800s weren't about wages? What if they were about the workers refusing to handle the old world equipment they were being forced to uncover? I found a fragmented report from a labour organiser in 1877 who spoke of the hum that makes the teeth bleed. He was describing the sensation of working in the deeper tunnels of the American East Coast, where the original infrastructure was still active. The skepticism of the modern historian is a shield against the sombre reality that our ancestors were terrified of the world they inherited. They lived in the shadows of giants, and they spent their lives trying to cover those shadows with coal smoke. The staccato rhythm of the steam engine was a deliberate interference pattern, a way to drown out the low-frequency resonance of the atmospheric grid that still pulsed in the rails. We moved from a world of silent, pervasive energy to one of loud, dirty, controlled combustion. Not an evolution, a regression. The contrast of scale in the grand halls of the world station serves a dual purpose. It humbles the individual, yes, but it also provides the necessary volume for the accumulation of atmospheric charge. I measured the ceiling height in the main hall of the Milan Central Station. It is a perfect multiple of the resonant frequency of the local geomagnetic field. This is not aesthetic harmony. This is electrical engineering. The institutional gatekeepers will tell you it is the still littorio, a political statement in stone, but the stone doesn't care about politics. The stone cares about vibration. When the trains pull into these stations, They aren't just delivering passengers, they are completing a circuit. The rails, the wheels, the station, and the atmosphere are all part of a single massive machine. And we, the passengers, are simply the biological component, the salt in the battery. Ask yourself why you feel so drained after a long journey. It isn't the travel, it's the extraction. I tracked the Tartarian signature to the Far East, to the impossible stations of the Trans-Siberian Railway. In places where the permafrost makes traditional construction a nightmare, you find neoclassical palaces that have not shifted a millimetre in 150 years. How did they sink the foundations? How did they keep the stone from cracking in the 60-degree below zero winters? The official records speak of thousands of convict labourers, but even 1 million men cannot change the laws of thermodynamics, unless, of course, the stone was heated from within. I found evidence of thermal cores in the basements of these stations, devices that the Soviet authorities later labelled as experimental furnaces and removed. But the heat didn't come from coal. It came from the earth itself, tapped by the station's original designers. The rail network was a heat exchange system for a global civilization. We have turned it into a graveyard of rusted iron and broken dreams. The erasure trope is most effective when it is invisible. It is the missing flaw in the architectural diagram. It is its utility closet that requires a top-secret clearance to enter. In the London Underground, there are entire stations that have been deleted from the maps, not because they are disused, but because they contain the original old-world machinery that is still functioning. I spoke to a former maintenance worker who claimed he saw a room in the deep level of the Northern Line where the walls were made of a self-luminous glass. He was told it was radioactive waste and to never return. It wasn't waste, it was the source. The skepticism of authority is the only rational response when you realise that the very air you breathe in the subway is being filtered by a technology they claim doesn't exist. Not this reality, not that fiction, something else. A subterranean world that runs on a different clock while we march to the staccato beat of the turnstile. Consider the orphan trains of the mid-19th century. Thousands of children moved by rail to the frontiers of the world. We are told they were being sent to new homes, but look at these logistics. These were the repopulation agents for the found cities. They were the blank slates upon which the new history would be written. The impossible stations were the processing centres. They arrived at these grand terminals, saw the ancient architecture, and were told that their new leaders had built it all for them. It was a psychological masterstroke. If you want to own the future, you must first fabricate the past. The institutional gatekeepers used the rail network to distribute a new humanity, one that wouldn't remember the world that came before. We are the descendants of those orphans, wandering through our own heritage like tourists in a foreign land. The technical language used to describe these stations, cantilevered trusses, barrel vaults, clerestory windows, is a form of linguistic erasure. It takes a miraculous feat of energy manipulation and turns it into a mundane fact of carpentry. I stood beneath the glass roof of the Madrid Atocha station and felt the weight of the lie. The iron supports are arranged in a fractal pattern that is mathematically identical to an antenna array. This isn't for natural light, it's for natural power. The irony is that we now fill these spaces with tropical plants and coffee shops, trying to reclaim a sense of life in a place that was once the very definition of it. We are decorating a corpse. The skepticism I harbour is a sombre one, for it suggests that the peak of our species is behind us, buried under 1,000 layers of soot and standardized history? What if the Tartarian infrastructure wasn't just for Earth? I found a set of astronomical alignments in the layout of the Union stations across North America. When viewed from above, the stations form a map of the stars as they appeared 10,000 years ago. The rail lines aren't just connecting cities, they are mirroring the heavens. This suggests a civilization that didn't just understand the Earth, but the cosmos. They weren't building for a decade, they were building for an eon. And we, in our frantic staccato short-sightedness, are tearing it all down to build luxury condos. The erasure is almost complete. The last of the original harvesters are being removed from the rooftops, replaced by 5G towers that pulse with a much more sinister frequency. We are replacing a system of healing with a system of surveillance. The unresolved philosophical open loop is a question of intent. Was the old world destroyed, or did it simply transcend? If the impossible train stations were the gateways to a more advanced way of living, why did they leave them behind? Perhaps they are not relics, but tests. Perhaps the tracks don't lead to a destination, but to a decision. We can continue to be the passengers, or we can learn to be the engineers. I look at the brass fitting in my hand, the one I took from the sub-basement of St. Pancras. It is still cold, it is still waiting. The history books are closed, but the stone is still open. The staccato rhythm of the heart is the only thing that matters now. Ask yourself, what if the train isn't coming for you? What if you are the one who has to start the engine? I found a series of structural cross-sections in a private collection in Budapest, detailing the foundations of the Keleti terminal. The drawings were executed on a vellum that felt more like a cured skin than paper, and the ink possessed a metallic sheen that refused to fade. These diagrams revealed that the station's load distribution was managed by a series of subterranean mercury-filled gyroscopes designed to anchor the building against the literal rotation of the Earth. Ask yourself why a Victorian architect would need to account for the Coriolis effect in a stationary building. The institutional gatekeepers dismissed these plans as speculative fiction or eccentric discarded drafts. But the physical footprints of these gyroscopes remain in the deep sub-basements, now capped with 6 feet of lead-reinforced concrete. Not a mistake, not a fantasy, something else. A technology that understood the planet as a kinetic battery. We are told the 19th century was the age of steam, yet the bones of our cities are built on the principles of etheric resonance and magnetic levitation. The erasure trope has been so thoroughly applied that we no longer recognize the anomaly even when it is staring us in the face. Consider the grand staircases that define the entrance of every major terminal. They are built with a geological permanence that mocks the transient nature of the human commute. In many of these stations, the stairs lead to nowhere, or rather, they lead to walls that were clearly added later. I traced the masonry in the Grand Central Terminal and found that the original flow of the building was circular, not linear. The passengers were meant to move in a vortex, a specific pattern of movement that would have generated a static charge. This charge was then collected by the copper-laced freezers and sent upward to the atmospheric harvesters. The modernization of the terminal has broken this circuit, forcing us into the staccato, jagged lines of the modern security queue. We are no longer being energized, we are being neutralized. The skepticism of the official record becomes a somber necessity when you investigate the Great Depressions of the 1800s. We are told these were periods of economic hardship, yet these were the exact years when the most impossible stations were being built at the highest rate. How does a bankrupt nation finance a palace of granite and gold? They don't. they uncover them. The depressions were periods of social restructuring used to clear the streets while the heavy work of reclaiming the old world infrastructure was carried out. I found a letter from a railway executive in 1894 who lamented that the cleaning of the lower levels was taking longer than anticipated because the original inhabitants had left behind bioluminescent waste. That was difficult to neutralise, not this labour, not that economy, something else, an environmental clean-up on a planetary scale, hidden behind the narrative of a stock market crash. The contrast of scale in the vaulted ceilings is not merely about height, it is about the compression of the air. In a resonant cavity like the Antwerp Central Station, the very atmosphere becomes a medium for power. If you stand in the centre of the hall and hum a specific note, the entire building responds. It is a giant tuning fork. The institutional gatekeepers have installed massive speakers and digital displays to disrupt this natural frequency, creating an acoustic environment that is chaotic and draining. They don't want the building to vibrate in sympathy with your heart. They want you disconnected. I measured the magnetic field in the centre of the Gare du Palais in Quebec City and found a persistent anomaly, a localised gravity well that fluctuates with the phases of the moon. The building isn't just sitting on the ground, it is tethered to the tide. The erasure is even more blatant when you examine the standardisation of time. Before the late 19th century, every town had its own local time, dictated by the sun. The railways forced the implementation of standard time, a move we are told was for the sake of the schedules. But what if it was to synchronise the grid? If the impossible stations were part of a global energy network, they had to be in perfect phase. The clocks weren't for the people, they were the metronomes for the power. When the grid was finally hijacked and the free energy replaced by the metered burn of coal, the clocks remained as a reminder of our new servitude. We are now slaves to a rhythm that was once the pulse of our freedom. The staccato ticking of the station clock is the sound of a heartbeat that has been captured and caged. I tracked the architectural DNA to the massive terminals of South America, specifically the Estação da Luz in São Paulo. It was prefabricated in England and shipped across the ocean. Ask yourself the logistics of shipping thousands of tons of cast iron and carved stone across the Atlantic in the 1890s, then transporting it through a jungle to a plateau. It is a logistical absurdity. It is far more likely that the shipping was a cover for the excavation of an existing site. The English style was simply the brand chosen to mark the territory. The institutional gatekeepers use the term prefabricated as a catch-all for anything they cannot explain. It is a magic word that makes the impossible sound like a manufacturing triumph, but the rust on the iron tells a different story. It is older than the factory it supposedly came from. The sombre reality of the mud flood evidence is most visible in the train yards. I spent a night in the abandoned yards outside of St. Louis, where the earth had eroded away to reveal the tops of even larger arches buried 30 feet below the current tracks. There is an entire second level of the rail network that we have never used. It is larger, grander, and still largely intact. The pioneers of the 19th century simply laid their tracks on the roofs of the old world. We are skimming the surface of a civilization that was once truly global. The skepticism, I feel, toward the history books is not a choice. It is a reaction to the physical reality of the ground. We are living in a two-story world and pretending the ground floor doesn't exist. The technical terms like thermal expansion are used to explain why these buildings groan and pop at night, but it isn't the heat. It is the building trying to settle back into its original frequency. The stone remembers the light. I found a diary of a night watchman in a station in Edinburgh who claimed that at exactly 4 a.m. the shadows in the main hall would move against the light. He said the building was rehearsing for a train that would never arrive. It is a heartbreaking image, a masterpiece of technology waiting for a signal that has been jammed. The erasure trope has not only taken our history, it has taken our future. We have been stalled on the platform for 100 years, waiting for a conductor who sold the engine for scrap. What if the Tartarian Empire was actually the original architect of the human soul? The stations were not just for travel. They were for the elevation of the spirit. The grand proportions and resonant acoustics were designed to induce a state of coherence in the traveller. You didn't just arrive at your destination, you arrived at a higher version of yourself. This is why the modern stations are so depressing, so utilitarian, and so hostile. They are designed to keep us in a state of low-level anxiety. The institutional gatekeepers know that a coherent population is impossible to control. They have turned our cathedrals into cages and our transit hubs into holding pens. The contrast of scale is now a tool of intimidation rather than inspiration. The unresolved philosophical open loop remains. If the machine is still there and the power is still there, why can't we turn it on? The answer is hidden in the staccato rhythm of our daily lives. We are too busy, too tired, and too afraid to look up. We have accepted the lie because the truth is too big to carry, but the impossible stations are still there, standing as silent witnesses to a glory we have been taught to forget. I looked at the station in the distance, its copper roof glowing in the twilight like a dying ember. It is not a ruin. It is a dormant heart. And one day the frequency will match. One day the circuit will close. The question is, will we be ready to board when the real train finally pulls in? I moved through the echoing corridors of the Mumbai Chhatrapati Shivaji terminus, formerly Victoria terminus, where the fusion of Gothic revival and traditional Indian motifs serves as a dense, decorative screen for a structural reality that is anything but traditional. Here, the load distribution is handled by a series of ribbed vaults that mimic the skeletal structure of a living organism. Ask yourself why a railway station in the humid heat of the subcontinent requires the thermal mass of a fortress. The official history tells us it was designed by Frederick William Stevens, an architect who supposedly mastered the complexities of Vedic geometry and European structural engineering in a single afternoon. But if you strip away the gargoyles and the friezes, you find a framework of salt-resistant iron that shows no signs of oxidation after more than a century in the sea air. Not this craftsmanship. Not that genius. Something else. A metallurgical secret that has been lost to the standardized smelting processes of the modern era. The erasure trope is visible in the way the station has been disconnected from the surrounding water table. I found old maps showing a series of canals that once terminated directly beneath the station's foundations. We are told these were for drainage, but a drainage system does not require the use of piezoelectric quartz in its lining. The water was a component. It was the electrolyte. The stations were positioned at the intersection of water and rail because the movement of the one generated the power for the other. The institutional gatekeepers filled the canals with concrete in the 1920s, claiming they were a health hazard. In reality, they were cutting the fuel lines. They replaced the fluid, organic energy of the earth with the rigid, taxable energy of the coal-fired grid. Now, the station stands as a beautiful, hollow monument, a heart that has been drained of its blood. The skepticism of the investigator is piqued by the great renovation projects that seem to happen every 40 years. These are not about maintenance. They are about the systematic removal of anomalous hardware. During the 1990s overhaul of the terminal, several decorative bronze spheres were removed from the roofline. I tracked one to a private warehouse. It wasn't bronze. It was a composite of layered mica and silver, a perfect capacitor for high-frequency atmospheric discharge. These spheres were the spark plugs of the building. The erasure is so thorough that the modern architects who replaced them with plastic replicas didn't even know what they were looking at. They were told they were aesthetic finials, and they obeyed. The staccato rhythm of the jackhammer is the sound of the past being ground into dust so the future can be sold back to us at a premium. Consider the contrast of scale between the ticket booths and the grand arches they occupy. We have inserted our small, wooden, temporary lives into a permanent stone reality. In the station at Kyoto, which replaced a much older, impossible structure, the transition is jarring. The old foundations were so deep and so resonant that the modern builders had to use vibration dampening pads to keep the new glass from shattering. The earth there is still singing the old song, and it rejects the new, flat language of steel and plexiglass. What if the Tartarian builders didn't build for the people of their time, but for the earth herself? The stations were the contact points where the human world and the planetary world could converse. We have broken the telephone, and now we wonder why the silence is so unsettling. The institutional gatekeepers love to talk about man-hours and budgetary constraints when explaining why we can't build like this anymore. They say it's too expensive, but ask yourself, why was it cheaper for a society with handsaws and horse carts? The answer is that it wasn't cheaper, it was faster, because they weren't building. They were refining, they were polishing, they were adapting a pre-existing infrastructure of power into an infrastructure of transport. I found a collection of glass plate negatives from 1870 showing the construction of a rail bridge in the Pyrenees. The bridge is already there, weathered and ancient, and the workers are merely bolting the iron tracks onto the stone. The history books call it a triumph of modern engineering, but the photograph calls it a salvage operation. The somber tone of the investigation deepens when you realize the sheer number of people who died during the building of these lines. Millions of labourers, we are told, succumbed to disease and accidents, but in the graveyards along the Union Pacific or the Trans-Siberian, the names on the markers are often missing. They are unknown, or they are numbered. What if these weren't labourers? What if they were the people who already lived in these cities, the ones who refused to accept the new narrative? The rail lines were the paths of conquest, and the stations were the fortresses that secured the occupied territory. The impossible train stations are the victory monuments of a silent war. The technical terms of the era, ballast, sleeper, gauge, are all designed to make the rail network seem like a purely mechanical invention. But the ballast isn't just for stability. The specific type of crushed stone used in the 1800s was often high in silica, a natural semiconductor. The entire rail bed was a transmission line. The skepticism I feel toward the modern transit authority is a reflection of their own ignorance. They are running diesel engines on a quantum computer. They are worried about signal interference from cell phones, while the very ground they stand on is capable of transmitting enough power to light a city. They have forgotten the language of the rails, and all that is left is the staccato clatter of the wheels. In the archives of the Vatican, There are whispered rumours of a global meridian that was mapped using the rail network. Each station was a marker on a map of the world's nervous system. When the network was fractured into national rail companies, the map was torn to pieces. This was the birth of the modern nation state, the division of a unified world into manageable, competing sectors. The Tartarian problem isn't just about buildings, it's about the loss of a planetary consciousness. We were once a single civilization that could move mountains with a sound, and now we are a collection of tribes arguing over the price of a ticket to the next station. The erasure trope has a way of turning the truth into a fairy tale. They tell us about ghost trains and haunted stations to distract us from the fact that the buildings themselves are active. I stood in the abandoned Cincinnati subway, a system that was never finished, and I saw the lights flicker in the tunnels. There is no power running to those lines. There hasn't been for a century, but the air is charged, the walls are warm, the building is still trying to do its job. It doesn't know that the war is over. It doesn't know that we have surrendered not this failure, not that delay, something else, a deliberate abandonment of a system that was too efficient to be allowed to exist. The unresolved philosophical open loop is a question of memory. If we were to walk into a station today and truly see it, not as a place of transit, but as a place of power, would we even know what to do? We are like the survivors of a shipwreck who have found a grand piano on the beach and are using it to store dried fish. We have lost the music. The impossible stations are the instruments, and they are still in tune. They are waiting for a player. I looked at the grand organ-like pipes in the ceiling of the station in Liverpool, and I realised they weren't for air. They were for the voice of the earth. And one day, someone will find the key. One day, the staccato rhythm will smooth out into a single infinite note. I found myself standing in the hollowed-out carcass of the old Michigan Central Station in Detroit, a building that for decades stood as a skeletal reminder of a greatness we were told was temporary. Here, the load distribution is staggering. The massive Corinthian columns do not just support a roof, they anchor a structure that feels as though it was designed to withstand a tectonic shift. Ask yourself why a city that was, at the time of the station's construction, barely more than a manufacturing hub, required a waiting room that could comfortably house a Roman Senate. The institutional gatekeepers speak of the Beaux-Arts style, a decorative flourish of a wealthy era. But look at the basement levels, which were flooded for years. The water didn't rot the foundations. It didn't even stain the deepest layers of the stone. This is the geopolymer signature again. It is a material that grows stronger with age, a stone that sets by drawing minerals from the environment. Not this industrial concrete, not that Victorian brick, something else, a living masonry that the modern world has forgotten how to brew. The erasure trope in Detroit is particularly somber because the city itself was rebranded as the Motor City to justify the destruction of its impossible infrastructure. Before the car, Detroit had one of the most sophisticated electric streetcar networks in the world, a network that required no overhead wires and ran on the same frequency as the Great Station. When the automotive giants took over, they didn't just sell cars, they bought the rail lines and tore them out of the ground. They buried the tracks under layers of black asphalt, the literal grease of the new, dirty economy. The skepticism of the local historians is often suppressed by the narrative of urban decay, but the decay was a choice. It was a tactical withdrawal. If you make a building look like a ruin, people will stop asking what it was built for. They will see only the broken windows and not the resonant copper mesh still embedded in the window frames. I moved through the grand hall, where the staccato dripping of rainwater echoed like a slow-motion countdown. I measured the distance between the pillars and found they follow the Fibonacci sequence with a precision of less than a millimetre. This is not the work of labourers in 1913. This is the work of a civilization that understood the mathematical language of the universe. The contrast of scale here is heartbreaking. We have turned this temple of energy into a tech hub for a billionaire's vanity project. They are installing fibre optic cables and LED lights, plugging their tiny flickering toys into a giant that was meant to move continents. The institutional erasure is nearly complete. The new blueprints don't even acknowledge the existence of the level 4 tunnels that lead toward the river. Those tunnels are where the real work happened. Those are the intake valves for the river's kinetic energy, now sealed with environmental caps. Consider the great reset of the architectural record in the early 20th century. Suddenly, the men who built these masterpieces stopped building them. They retired. They changed their styles to the flat, soul-crushing functionalism of the modern era. Why? Because the knowledge was taken away. The blueprints were classified. The tools were destroyed. We were told that modernism was a choice of the people, a desire for simplicity. But ask yourself, who chooses a grey box over a palace of light? No one. It was a mandate. The impossible train stations were the last stand of a world that refused to be metered. When the last station was finished, the door was locked on the old world, and we were handed a set of keys that only opened the side entrances. The staccato beat of the modern city is a nervous twitch compared to the deep, slow pulse of these old world hubs. I stood in the centre of the Detroit terminal and hummed the note I had discovered in London. For a moment, the air seemed to shimmer. The dampness vanished. The cold stone felt warm, almost vibrating with a phantom limb of power. It was a reminder that the machine is not dead. It is merely disconnected. The skepticism of authority is the only thing that keeps us from being completely assimilated into the lie. We must be the investigative essayists of our own reality. We must look past the historical mystery and see the practical reality of what was stolen. What if the Tartarian grid is still active, just out of phase, with our current perception? What if the trains are still running on a different frequency and we are just the ghosts haunting the platforms? This is the unresolved philosophical open loop that keeps me awake. We think we are the ones who moved on, but perhaps we are the ones who were left behind. I looked up at the vaulted ceiling, where the plaster had peeled away to reveal the shimmering metallic lattice beneath. It looked like the brain of a god. And we are just the parasites living in the folds. Not this progress, not that future, something else. A return to the beginning, where the tracks end and the real journey begins.